My mom pushed my little daughter from her chair and said, "This table's for family. Go away." She fell hard. The room went silent. I helped her up and said 5 words. My mom's face went white. Mitel started to stammer. I've spent most of my adult life managing my parents like they're emotional toddlers, constantly validating them, tiptoeing around their moods, and pretending their insults were just jokes. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. Drop a message and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I just gripped the steering wheel of my vehicle and felt the cold Massachusetts air seep through the vents. Behind me, in the back seat, my 8-year-old daughter, Grace, was a ghost, silent. Still holding that name card she had decorated with sparkly markers and so much hope, I watched her in the rearview mirror. I wanted to tell her I was sorry. I wanted to tell her that her grandmother was just tired or stressed or having a bad day. But the lie died in my throat before it could even form. I was done with the lies. I was done with the scripts. I was 34 years old, and for the first time in my life, the air in my lungs felt like it actually belonged to me. The drive back from the yacht club was a blur of salt spray and streetlight. My mind kept looping back to the moment Grace hit the floor. The dining room had gone silent, but it wasn't out of respect for Kimberly. It was the suffocating silence of 50 high society witnesses watching her mask finally slip. In that world, she hadn't just pushed a child, she had committed social suicide. The sound of her small palm slapping the hardwood, the casual, bored tone in my mother's voice when she told my child to go away. I looked Kimberly dead in the eye, ignored her elite sneer, and delivered those 5 words: "Your ATM is now closed." The blood drained from her face as the finality of it hit her like a physical blow. It was a level of clinical cruelty that most people can't even imagine, but for me, it was just another Tuesday. The only difference was that this time, she had aimed her poison at my daughter instead of me. Looking back, I realized I had been caught in what psychologists call the invisible chain of the survivor. It is a specialized kind of prison. You see, when you grow up with parents like Kimberly and Kenneth, you do not learn how to be a person. You learn how to be a radar. You spend every waking second scanning the horizon for the next storm. Is mom's voice too high? Is dad's silence too heavy? You learn that the only way to keep the house from burning down is to throw yourself into the fire every single time. My silence for all those years wasn't a choice, it was a survival mechanism. It was a cage without bars. I had been conditioned into a state of learned helplessness. It is a phenomenon where you stop trying to escape an abusive environment because you have been punished so many times for trying to be your own person. You start to believe that the mistreatment is just the price of admission for belonging. I had been paying that price for 34 years, tiptoeing around their moods like I was walking through a minefield in high heels. The gala had been a sea of silk and fake smiles. I had been the one who organized the entire evening. I was the one who made sure the VIP guests were comfortable. I was the silent investor in their version of family. I provided the capital, my emotional labor, my logistic skills, my literal money, and they provided the insults. I realized then that my compassion had been a luxury they had overdrawn for years. When I told my mother, "You are not family to her," I was not being dramatic. I was being an accountant. I was looking at an emotional balance sheet that had been in the red since the day I was born. I didn't feel the heat of anger. I felt the ice-cold clarity of a business decision. This was not a family crisis. It was a total liquidation of a toxic asset. I watched the road and realized that my parents were not shocked by what they had done to Grace. They were only shocked that I had stopped playing along. They were terrified because their unpaid secretary had finally walked off the job. I could feel the old familiar pull of guilt trying to creep back in, telling me to turn the car around, telling me to apologize for embarrassing them. But then I looked at Grace again. I saw the confusion in her eyes, and the final fuse blew in my head. I stayed awake that night, not out of sorrow, but out of auditing. I pulled up my financial spreadsheets and looked at the cold, hard data. For years, I had been the family's primary funding source. When my sister, Cassandra, decided she needed a fresh start, I was the one who cut a check for $25,000 for her new SUV. My parents told me it was an investment in her future, but Cassandra didn't have a future. She had a lifestyle, and I was the one sponsoring it. Then there are my father's medical bills. Every month, I paid over $1,000 directly to his providers to stay fiscally responsible and tax compliant. I thought I was being a diligent daughter. I didn't realize I was just making it easier for them to rob me blind elsewhere. They told me it was my obligation as the successful daughter. They never mentioned that Kimberly spent twice that much on designer handbags and Coastal Club memberships. I finally saw my kindness for what it was, a currency they had spent until the account was bone dry. I lived in a studio apartment with thrifted chairs and generic brand cereal, while my mother sat on $500 silk cushions. This was the trap of normalized cruelty. In my family, the exploitation wasn't an event, it was the atmosphere. Kimberly and Kenneth didn't see me as a daughter. They saw me as a high-yield savings account. To them, my existence was transactional. This is the reality of narcissistic parenting. They normalize the exploitation of one child to maintain the comfort of the golden child. Cassandra was the trophy. I was the maintenance crew. They didn't feel guilty about taking my money because, in their minds, I only existed to serve their image. I had been their unpaid secretary, their personal chauffeur, and their digital technician. I managed their insurance, their electricity bills, and even that useless newspaper subscription Kenneth refused to let go of. I had all their passwords. I knew their account balances. I was the one who made sure their lights stayed on while they lived. They didn't realize that my reliability was actually the only thing keeping their world from collapsing. As I sat there, the blue light of my laptop screen reflecting in my eyes, I realized I had been a silent partner in my own destruction. But the audit was over. The balance was zero. And I was about to initiate a total digital blackout. At 11:51 p.m., the first text arrived. My phone vibrated against the nightstand with a violent, rhythmic persistence that used to make my stomach drop. For years, a late-night text from Kimberly meant an emergency I had to solve, a mood I had to manage, or a fire I had to put out. But tonight, I just watched the screen glow in the dark room. "You are being incredibly selfish," Katherine, the message read, "to walk out like that, in front of everyone. You humiliated us. Your father is devastated. We expect a formal apology by morning." I didn't feel the sting I usually felt. I didn't feel the desperate urge to explain myself or beg for their understanding. Instead, I felt like I was reading a poorly written script from a play I had already quit. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a shred of regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I sat up and opened my laptop. The light from the screen was cold and blue, perfectly matching the state of my mind. For the last decade, I had been the silent investor in their version of family. I was the one who had kept the gears turning, the one who navigated the complex web of their finances because Kimberly wasn't good with numbers and Kenneth was too busy. I had all their passwords saved. I had their social security numbers memorized. As an accountant, I should have seen the red flags sooner. But my mother had been intercepting my physical mail for years and rerouting my digital credit alerts to an old email address I hadn't used since college. She used my trust as a tactical firewall against the truth. I was the invisible architect of their comfort. I logged into their Massachusetts Electric account first. For 3 years, I had set up an automatic payment from my own checking account to cover their utility bills. It was one of those temporary arrangements that had somehow become a permanent fixture of my monthly expenses. I clicked through the settings until I reached the payment portal. My finger didn't even tremble as I hit the button to cancel the recurring transfer. Next was their homeowner's insurance and the premium health coverage I'd been subsidizing for Kenneth. I was covering their premium Medigap plans and non-formulary prescriptions that Medicare refused to touch. It was a $1,000 a month lifeline they took for granted while spending their own Social Security checks on Coastal Club dues. That was another $1,000 a month that I'd been pouring into a void of ungratefulness. I removed my credit card information from the billing profiles and reverted the accounts to manual pay. Finally, I navigated to the website for the Coastal Yacht Club, the very place where my mother had pushed my daughter to the floor just hours ago. The membership dues were astronomical, a quarterly payment of $5,000 that they absolutely could not afford on their Social Security checks alone. They had been living a champagne life on my beer budget labor. I canceled the auto pay, knowing the next installment was due in 48 hours. Their confusion didn't stem from guilt, it came from the sudden loss of their most reliable puppet. They had viewed my love as a subscription service one where I footed the bill while they enjoyed the perks. But the subscription had expired. As I closed the laptop, the silence in my apartment felt heavy and sweet. I looked at the dark hallway and thought about the morning. They would wake up in their big coastal house, blissfully unaware that the digital safety net I had woven around them was gone. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, and now the account was closed. Inside, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. It was calm. It was factual. It was lethal. The next morning, I didn't reach for my phone to check for apologies or more accusations. I reached for a professional. I called Vanessa. She had been my closest friend since college, the kind of person who sees a problem and immediately looks for the leverage. Now, she was one of the most respected family law attorneys in the state. I told her everything, not as a daughter seeking sympathy, but as a client presenting a case for professional escalation. We met at her office downtown. It was all glass, steel, and a quiet sense of order. It was the complete opposite of the home I had grown up in. I laid out the spreadsheets. I showed her the transfers. I explained that I had been the silent investor in their version of family for a decade. Vanessa didn't offer a hug. She offered a highlighter. We started with the house. 4 years ago, I had provided $50,000 for the down payment on their coastal property. It was supposed to be an investment, a way to ensure they were stable in their retirement. Kenneth had promised my name would be on the deed as a joint owner, but as Vanessa pulled up the public records, her expression went cold. "Kat," she said, turning the monitor toward me, "your name isn't here. It was removed 3 years ago. There is a quitclaim deed on file with what looks like your signature." My blood didn't boil. It froze. I hadn't signed any such document. I realized then that they hadn't just used me. They had erased me. They didn't just want my money. They wanted to remove any evidence that I had a right to exist in their world. Vanessa didn't wait for me to process the shock. This was the moment where the conflict shifted from personal to professional. "This isn't just family drama anymore," she said with lethal precision. "This is fraud." But we started with the civil route first. She drafted a formal demand letter. We weren't asking for love. We were initiating a collection. The notice was simple: a formal demand letter coupled with a draft of a criminal referral for identity theft and forgery. They had 30 days to initiate a repayment plan or face an immediate investigation by the district attorney. As I watched the printer spit out the pages, I felt a strange sense of peace. For 34 years, I had been trying to win a game where the rules were designed to make me lose. Now, I was playing a different game. One with laws, evidence, and consequences. I wasn't their daughter today. I was their primary creditor. And the grace period was officially over. The professional path didn't stop at demand letters. Vanessa insisted that if they were capable of forging a property deed, they were capable of anything. We needed the source code of their deception. While my parents were out at the club, likely trying to charm a new silent investor to cover their quarterly dues, I used my old code to enter the house. I wasn't there for a sentimental visit. I was there for an audit. The attic was stifling. It smelled of cedar, mothballs, and the heavy, stagnant air of a history built on lies. I bypassed the boxes of holiday decorations and the crates of Cassandra's old trophies. I was looking for a blue plastic bin I remembered seeing years ago, labeled simply with my mother's name. I found it tucked behind a stack of Kenneth's old blueprints. Inside was a leather-bound chest, locked. Vanessa handed me a small pry bar she'd brought in her bag. We didn't hesitate. The lock snapped with a sharp metallic crack that echoed through the hollow space. I pulled back the lid, expecting more financial records or perhaps some hidden debt. What I found was a kill shot. At the very top was a thick envelope from a prestigious writing program in New York. It was dated 12 years ago. I pulled out the parchment, my fingers feeling the embossed seal. It was a full tuition scholarship offer, a complete ride. All expenses covered. I sat there in the dust, reading the words I'd never been allowed to see. "Congratulations, Katherine. Based on your merit and potential." I remembered that summer perfectly. I was 18. I had waited by the mailbox every day for months. When I asked my mother if anything had arrived, she had looked me in the eye and told me that I wasn't college material and that the schools had clearly agreed because no letters had come. I had stayed home. I worked 3 part-time jobs and handed over my checks to help the family. But the envelope wasn't the worst part. Tucked beneath it was the school's official rejection form. It had been filled out and mailed back. At the bottom, in the space for the student's signature, was my name. The loops of the letters were too perfect, the pressure of the pen too heavy. It was Kimberly's handwriting. She hadn't just hidden my future, she had actively murdered it. Vanessa reached into the chest and pulled out a second folder, a trust fund audit from a bank I hadn't recognized. It was the education fund my grandparents had established for me before they passed. The balance was listed as 0. I scanned the withdrawal history. I realized then that she had exploited her status as the custodian of my old UTMA account, failing to transfer control when I turned 21, and instead using an old power of attorney to forge my signature yet again. She had systematically drained $40,000. Every cent was diverted into a separate account used to fund Cassandra's sorority fees, designer clothes, and European spring break trips. I stared at the numbers. It was a ledger of theft. They hadn't just stolen my money, they had stolen my time, my potential, and my autonomy. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel my heart rate increase. My mind went into logistics mode. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. This was a criminal case. I took a high-resolution photo of every document and handed the folder to Vanessa. "This is it," she whispered, her professional mask finally cracking with a hint of disgust. "This is the forgery. This is the embezzlement. This is the end of the line." I looked around the dusty attic one last time. This house was a monument to my exploitation. I closed the chest and stood up. I rubbed the dust from my hands, feeling the weight of the evidence in my pocket. I wasn't a daughter looking for an apology. I was a victim holding the smoking gun, and I was going to make sure the next person to read these files was wearing a robe or a badge. The doorbell rang at 7:42 p.m. on a Tuesday. I didn't need to look through the peephole to know who was standing on my porch. My phone had been a graveyard of ignored notifications for days, calls from my aunt, emails from distant cousins, and voicemails from Kenneth that started with demands and ended in whispers. I stood in my kitchen, finishing a glass of water, and felt a strange sense of stillness. When I opened the door, the contrast was staggering. Just weeks ago, at the gala, Kimberly had looked like a queen, her spine straight and her chin tilted with that toxic brand of coastal elitism. Now, she looked smaller. Her expensive wool coat was wrinkled, and the makeup she had applied to hide the stress was caked into the lines around her eyes. Beside her, Kenneth was staring at his shoes, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of his own choices had finally exceeded his capacity to carry them. "Katherine," my mother started, her voice missing its usual edge. It was soft now, pleading. "We need to talk. We've had a situation." "The power is out, isn't it?" I asked. My tone was clinical, factual, lethal. "It's more than that," Kenneth stammered. "The bank, they sent a notice. The quarterly dues for the club, the insurance, the arrears on the second mortgage. They're threatening to initiate foreclosure within 30 days. They weren't shocked by what they'd done to Grace. They were only shocked that I'd stopped playing along. I watched them and realized I was witnessing the illusion of power from an empty wallet. For decades, their authority over me had been built on a foundation of perceived status and moral superiority. But that status was a rental, and I was the one who had been paying the lease. Without my capital, their personality collapsed. They had no internal value to stand on, so they were folding like a house of cards in a Massachusetts gale. "We're family, Kat," Kimberly said, reaching out as if to touch my arm. I stepped back. "We've made mistakes, yes, but you can't just watch us lose everything. We need $90,000 to clear the immediate debts and restructure. Think about your sister. Think about the family legacy." "I've been thinking about the legacy," I said. I reached for the thick manila folder resting on the hall table. "I spent some time in the attic this weekend. I did some accounting of my own. I pulled out the New York scholarship letter. I watched my mother's eyes fix on the embossed seal, and for the first time in my life, I saw genuine, unadulterated fear on her face. "You hid this from me when I was 18, I said. "You told me I wasn't college material while you were holding my future in your hands. But that wasn't the worst part. I flipped to the next page, the rejection form with the forged signature. You signed my name, you rejected my life for me, and then I pulled out the trust fund audit. You systematically drained $40,000 from the education fund my grandparents left me. You forged my signature a dozen times to pay for Cassandra's sorority dues and her spring break trips. Kenneth looked like he was going to be sick. Kimberly didn't apologize. She didn't even have the grace to look ashamed. She just started to plot. Katherine, we can explain. The money was for the family. I wasn't your daughter today. I was your primary creditor, I told her. I didn't destroy this family, Kimberly. You murdered it 12 years ago when you decided my potential was a resource you could liquidate. This wasn't a family dynamic. It was an embezzlement scheme. Please, Kenneth whispered, if you report this, if you don't help us pay the bank, we have nowhere to go. Then you'll have to do what you told me to do when I was 18, I said. My voice was as cold as the Atlantic. Figure it out. I looked at the two people who had raised me to believe I was a burden while they lived off my stolen life. They weren't my parents anymore. They were just two people who had defaulted on a debt they could never repay. I am no longer your daughter. I delivered the finisher. I am your creditor, and I'm calling in the loan. I closed the door. I didn't wait for them to leave. I didn't look through the window. I just locked the deadbolt and engaged the chain. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy with the weight of justice. I walked back to my kitchen and sat down. I didn't feel a breakdown coming. I felt a balance sheet coming to zero. The account was officially closed. The legal system moved with the precision I had never experienced but finally appreciated. Kimberly and Kenneth could not run from the paper trail Vanessa and I had meticulously established. To avoid immediate criminal prosecution for felony forgery and embezzlement, they were forced into an emergency liquidation of the coastal house and their remaining assets. The status they had rented with my life was gone. Cassandra, the golden child who had never known a day of real labor, was forced to find a job working for someone else, earning her own way for the very first time. As for that $25,000 SUV I'd bought for her, since the title was in my name, I had it repossessed and sold within 48 hours. She can walk to her new job. I refuse to fund a lifestyle for someone who looked the other way while my daughter was being hurt. But my victory wasn't found in their collapse. It was found in what I did with the return funds. I took that $40,000 and established a Grace Endowment, a dedicated scholarship fund within a national youth advocacy organization. This fund is dedicated to providing legal support and counseling for children and young adults who are trapped in environments of psychological and financial exploitation. This was my act of planting seeds, the justice of the sower. I realized that while the law handles the punishment of the past, we are the ones responsible for constructing the future. I have come to realize that we are often pressured to keep the peace because family is everything. But the truth is, the peace you keep at the expense of your own soul is just a slow-acting poison. Forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it simply means closing the door so firmly that the draft can no longer reach you. If you find yourself acting as a tool for people who refuse to see your humanity, remember that you don't owe your potential to your abusers. I look at Grace now, and I see a child who will never have to wonder if she belongs at the table. We didn't rebuild the past, we built something better. If Catherine's story helped you find your own voice, please press the share button so it reaches someone else who needs the permission to stand up for themselves. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to join us in spreading more stories of justice and resilience. Thank you for listening until these final moments.